¿Esperamos un poco más o empiezo ya?
Vale, yo diría, porque yo tendré que salir más o menos sobre las 12, así que prefiero no prolongarlo y así no comemos nuestro tiempo. Creo que la gente se va a ir a sumar. Creo que la presentación tiene muchos puntos interesantes y cada uno se puede juntar cuando quiera. Pueden estar tranquilos. Yo diría comenzar ya y...
Vale.
I vale.
Vale. Doncs molt bon dia a qui ha vingut. Que estigui a la fase 1, felicitats. Aquí encara estem a la fase 0. Continuem avui amb la ponència sobre economies heterodoxes aquí mentre estem confinats. La primera va ser càrrec de Guillem López Casasnovas i la segona, la que va ser la setmana passada, va ser càrrec de José García Montalvo i aquesta parla sobre decreixement i és a càrrec de Filka Sekulova. Primer de tot, diria de silenciar els micròfons i apagar les càmeres perquè així és més fàcil per la Filka. I la ponència més o menys durarà màxim fins a les 12, com acaba de dir. I la mateixa Filka ha proposat que si voleu fer preguntes, doncs llanceu les preguntes al xat i ella mateixa les recollirà i les respondrà. Així que no cal ni esperar al final per fer les preguntes. Faig una mica d'introducció de Postcrash. Som una associació que la UPF es va crear el 2015, que es dedica a oferir als estudiants diferents metodologies i perspectives més interdisciplinars dintre de l'economia i per això aconseguir l'objectiu organitzem una sèrie de conferències, debats i amb especialistes de diferents escoles de pensament, professors d'economia i investigadors. La Filka, que és la nostra ponent d'avui, és graduada en Psicologia i en Economia i és doctora en Economia de Canvi Climàtic per la UAB. Forma part de l'Institute of Environmental Science and Technology, és membre del think tank Research and Growth, com veieu a la portada de la seva presentació, i va formar part del projecte de la Unió Europea Towards European Societal Sustainability. I la seva investigació es centra en el decreixement sostenible, el benestar i els factors d'èxit de les iniciatives comunitàries, entre altres branques. Així doncs, deixo que Filka comenci la seva presentació i això. Si teniu qualsevol pregunta o qualsevol dubte, tireu-la al xat sense por.
Sí. Gracias, Carles, por la invitación. Gracias por la oportunidad de compartir algo del mundo de Decreixement con todas vosotras. Espero que no os importe si lo hago en inglés, porque así creo que tengo el vocabulario un poco más fluido, pero por favor que hagáis las preguntas en catalán, en castellano o la lengua que puedo hablar, también puede ser en búlgaro. Bueno, so today our talk is going to be about degrowth. This is a talk that I did last year with the students of UPF, and this year I had to adapt it a lot and try to see how the idea of degrowth is situated in the health crisis today. Well, let's start with the whole idea of the fact that there has been unprecedented improvement in all the medical treatments and all the, let's say, health developments over the last 200 years. And nevertheless, we're facing an unprecedented health crisis. Well, precedented health crisis, one of the health crises that we have seen over the last century and let's say a couple of centuries ago. So why is that? I would like to, of course, there are multiple reasons, and one cannot spot one single factor for the emergence of the COVID. But still, today I want to stress your attention to one important element that has to do with growth. And this is the outline of the talk. But let's say, I think it will be really interesting to start thinking about the meaning of economic growth and actually what's wrong with economic growth, our obsession with economic growth. So let's start with, let's say, one slightly economic representation. The first thing to say about economic growth is that it's not longer economic in the sense that there have been more than 30 years since the period when growth is no longer actually beneficial. If you look at this graph, you could see that the total benefits of economic growth are no longer bigger than the total costs of economic growth. And from that point, the costs of economic growth, and this could even quantified in economic terms, would actually translate into a cost of all environmental damage, cost of all depleted natural resources, cost of unreported domestic labor, cost of exploitation and coloniality and colonialism. So if you correct growth and GDP for all these, as we call it in economics, externalities, although and from ecological economics, they're not externalities, but they're actually internal part of the process of capital accumulation. So you could see that growth and the benefits of growth are actually not economic and not kind of contributing to the welfare of humanity. On the other hand, there is kind of, over the last more than 3 years ago, quite some kind of even investment funds are finding that we might be coming to a point of kind of saturation, or that economic growth is coming to an end. For example, you could hear fund managers reporting that you cannot expect more than 0.61% growth. I'm not talking about the context of the crisis, right? I'm talking about the context before the crisis. So you could see that growth is actually no estoy compartiendo la pantalla. Perdón. A ver. No estoy. You're presenting. Dices que no estoy. Perdona, Carlos. Dices que no estoy compartiendo la pantalla.
Sí, estabas hablando del gráfico, pero estabas aún en la primera slide del PowerPoint. Ahora sí que se ve el gráfico, por eso.
Vale. Sí, vale. Perdón. Sí. ¿Ahora sí lo veis?
No sé si... Ahora se ve el gráfico, pero tampoco sé si se está compartiendo bien.
La otra posibilidad, Carles, ¿quieres compartirlo tú?
Comparto yo, sí.
No sé si tiene que ver con mi internet o porque, claro, aquí da que lo estoy compartiendo. Dice que estoy presente.
Hago yo, sin problema.
¿Sí?
¿Se ve mi pantalla?
A otra gente que dice que lo veis ve. Sí. Chicas, ¿podéis decir si lo veis, si veis bien la pantalla que estoy compartiendo? Sí, ajá. Sí. Ahora la gente dice que... Vale, parece que la mayoría de la gente dice que sí lo ve, ¿eh? Alejandra, Salvador, Jess, Claudia, Paul, Alejandro. Sí, ahora dicen que lo ven bien. Ok. ¿Lo has compartido tú, Carles?
Sí, pero no sé si estaban hablando de mi pantalla o de la suya.
Vale, entonces si querés, seguimos adelante y veremos qué pasa. ¿Sí?
Venga.
Sí, también puedo... solo un momento que quiero igual compartir... igual toda la pantalla. Vale, ya seguimos adelante. Sí. Entonces, ¿veis la próxima? ¿Me podéis confirmar por si podéis ver esta también? ¿Este slide? Sí, vale, perfecto. Entonces, bueno, back to economic growth. So the first point was that economic growth is no longer economic, just from pure let's say, quantitative terms, then it might be coming to an end. The second point of economic growth, and it's what's mostly promoted by the World Bank and by general international financial institutions like the IMF as well and the World Trade Organization, is that economic growth contributes to inequality and eradicates poverty. There is a lot of kind of nitty-gritty details around the way poverty is being defined and the way inequality is actually being measured. But actually, if you look at these two graphs, you would see that global inequality in most of the rich country has been increasing. And this is like from 1960 until 2016. This goes hand in hand with an increase of GDP per region. So although GDP has been increasing for all these regions, you can see the small graph of GDP per region, which let's say for North America, for Europe, for Latin America, and let's say for former Soviet Union, I have only this one. You could see that like GDP there is not increasing so much, but it follows more or less the curve of the inequality, what's going on. So, and if you look at the next graph, it's very interesting because if you look at the percentage change, it looks like the people are getting out of poverty together with economic growth. But what actually, if we look at the absolute change of income growth over the last, let's say, 30 years, you could see that, let's say, that the poorest 10 percentile of humanity, so those people who are like receiving less, having less level of income, have seen their income increase only by $193 per year. So this is for a period between between the 80s and 2016. So imagine, we're talking about more than 30 years. And so this is why it's kind of very important to also talk about absolute change rather than percentage change. You could see that the people located in the highest percentile, for example, the 80-20 percentile, let's say the richer people, even not the richest, because we all know about the richest, that like the income has actually got 100 times more over the last 30 years. But you could see that even, let's say, the upper middle class have also gained quite some more income. So the conclusion basically here is that economic growth has not been very successful in reducing poverty and has been terrible at reducing inequality. Actually, we could argue that economic growth coupled kind of with a particular schemes of export-driven growth and neoliberal governance, a capitalist type of development, is actually contributing to more inequality. And this is very important to have in mind when we talk about health pandemics, to know who has benefited more from economic growth and who has the capacity to recover faster. And another aspect to consider when we talk about economic growth is something we consider like it has to do with well-being, of happiness. And this has been one of the areas that I've been working over the last years. Because, okay, economic growth is very much promoted as a kind of way to make our lives better, right? To contribute to good life. But since the 50s on, when studies on happiness have been starting to appear and to measure people's level of satisfaction with life, we could see, as you could see in this graph, that the level of happiness has not been following the average increase in income. This is a graph for the United States, but a similar type of graph you could find for many European countries. And lately, you could also find for other emerging economies. So you could see that while income growth is actually going up, the percentage of the happy people, the very happy people, is actually not increasing. So what's going on? It seems that the accumulation of further material welfare is not making us have better life, or is not contributing to our subjective well-being over time. There are two reasons for this to happen. One is that we adapt. We just very easily get used to the high level of income. You get kind of salary increase, and within a couple of months you get used to that salary increase. So your level of satisfaction with life drops down to what it was in the beginning. Or we compare ourselves with the others. So we get a salary increase or we get a better car. But if everyone around us gets a better car, then we don't feel happy about the car. So in that sense, like all the material aspects of life that economic growth brings about is not contributing to happiness over time. And you would say that this might be only the case in developed countries. But if you look at the next graph, this is here you could see the distribution of happiness for China over the last, let's say, 20 years. And it's curious that in 1999, when GDP per capita was about 2,000, happiness was 4.7 on a scale of 10. While when, let's say, 10 years later, when the GDP of China has actually almost tripled, you could see that happiness has not even moved upwards, not at all. So what's going on? Why is it that in countries that become, let's say, the kind of machines of growth, so-called, where they have kind of improved incredibly transportation, let's say the speed of delivery, the kind of the machinery, the kind of the gadgets, the supermarket deliveries, agriculture, industrial agriculture have all these kind of they have also improved education and access to education. Why is it that happiness does not increase? What is there behind economic growth that actually does not make us more happy with our lives? So very much it has to do with speed and with pressure and work pressure, and actually inability to have time for the things we consider meaningful. So that's one aspect to consider when we talk about happiness. I just wanted to check out something on the screen. Meanwhile, please send me any message if you have a question. Let me know if I go too fast. I know this type of presentations are super impersonal, so it's kind of it's strange not to have contact with you. But please, if you don't understand something, if you have a question, just drop me a line and see, or if you want to know something about particular graph or metrics. Good. Okay, let's carry on. Of course, the relationship between economic growth and environmental disasters. Let's start with climate change. There is kind of increasing evidence that economic growth is coupled with kind of the increase of greenhouse gas emissions. One study from 2015 finds that 1% for each percent of GDP increase, greenhouse gas emissions increase between 0.6 and 0.8. It's almost one-to-one relationship. So of course, like more economic activity is very often related to burning fuels, or just like more animal agriculture, more mining, or even service economies imply a lot of resources being extracted from the ground, a lot of transportation, a lot of aviation, a lot of movement of people, a lot of high-speed kind of infrastructure construction, etc., etc., etc. So it's actually the growth of the national economies is really kind of very strongly related with environmental demolition of the environment, with climate change in particular. But let's move to the other elements, let's say beyond climate change. If you look at another data between, let's say, the 80s and 2008, we could see that the global GDP increased by almost 150%. And at the same time, material consumption has also been increasing, but almost 90%. So this means that while GDP has grown faster, consumption has also been increasing steadily. So the two actually cannot be decoupled one over the other. And the same is the case with raw materials. Every 1% of growth is associated with 0.8% increase in raw materials. In a sense, this means that the extraction of sand, of gold, of rare metals, of fossil fuels is actually really closely following the rate of economic growth. The same is the case with water shortages and the kind of the water availability. So and water pollution. So you could see the so-called water footprint is actually very negatively affected by economic growth. We could carry on to biodiversity, for example. No, let's. I have one more. Well, we could see here the graphs of what I was telling just before. How GDP is actually increasing and material footprint is actually following more or less the same curve. So it's very kind of obvious that much of the, let's say, environmental destruction and climate change advancement that's happening over the last years is very much kind of associated with economic growth and driven by economic growth. It's also interesting to look at biodiversity. And a recent study that was just published actually in 2020 by Otero and others and other colleagues from ICTA shows that actually the rate of GDP increase correlates very closely with the number of threatened species and endangered species. You could see in this graph how actually the GDP growth is actually, even over the last years, the rate of extinction or the rate of endangered species increase is actually above the rate of GDP increase. So, and here we have been, until now I've been talking about the, let's say, inequality, poverty, happiness, environment, resource extraction. This creates somehow the setting of growth. And so far I've been explaining the relationship between economic growth and environmental social degradation over the last years, let's say decades. So in what way economic growth could relate, not completely cause, but somehow facilitate the span of the health pandemics, let's say COVID. So let's go back to the common drivers of economic growth. Many of you are economists. You know about economies of scale, the importance of economies of scale for economic growth. You know what economies of scale mean. Larger surfaces, larger quantity, like grouping together machinery or productive capacities, labor and capital, so that like so the marginal cost could decrease, right? So in that sense, we have efficiency improvements. And thanks to that efficiency improvements, we could extract more benefits. We could lower costs and we could have higher market price. What does that mean in the sector of industrial agriculture? Well, on the first hand, economic growth objectives implies that we need large-scale animal farming. We need large-scale animal farming concentrated in particular countries and particular regions, which means like very high animal density. Animals that are crowded together in cages that they could hardly move, because that's efficient. Animals that cannot move their bodies out of the heavy weight that they have been kind of accumulating over the productivity. So actually putting productivity above animal welfare. So that has been creating, on the one hand, increased stress with animals and makes them the most stressed animals are, and the more they observe how their fellow animals are brought to the slaughter, the more lower capacity have their body to deal with illnesses. It's a bit like humans, right? When we are surrounded by stress, when we are stressed very much, we more easily fall ill. So actually it's very much the same with animals. So okay, one hand you have large-scale animal farming. On the other hand, more animal kind of farming requires more fodder. It requires more territories for planting soybeans, barley, and maize, or kind of corn. And of course, this happens on these territories that are cheaper. This means, and the cheaper territories that are not regulated, are the ones that are close to the tropical forest and kind of close to kind of indigenous people's habitats. So you could see how there has been a lot of deforestation and there has been a lot of pressure on land to grow animal fodder, very much based on monoculture and agrochemicals. And of course, what that happens is that this deforestation is furthered on and there is kind of biodiversity loss that's actually occurring. On the third place, we have also kind of increased level of international trade. Of course, those who have cheaper those who could produce meat and animal fodder cheaper are the ones who trade on with the others. So you need a lot of international trade. But that international trade, especially with live animals, and that faster mobility creates a lot of exchanges potentially between genomes and pathogens. So if you take into consideration these three factors, you could arrive at the following. On the one hand, deforestation, and this is actually reports by Robert Wallace, and in his book Big Farm Make Big Flu, but also a lot of other studies actually kind of finding more and more evidence. So you could see how economic growth and intensive animal production is pushing off deforestation. For deforestation, that's opening the door for more pathogens to flee out of the forest and to affect for different kind of intermediaries, domestic animals, and eventually humans. On the other hand, the crowded conditions depress the immune responses in larger animal population. So, and of course, in these intensive animal factories, you have animals with they're bred to have identical genomes, to have identical type of food and bodies and identical type of features, so that they could be sold eventually. But the fact that they're identical makes them more prone to viruses, and actually reduces eventually their capacity to resist to viruses. They have less immunity in a way. Meanwhile, in more diverse population, let's say in forests, we have a lot of diversity in different animals and different kind of and animals that have different levels of their age, and animals that have passed through different phases have much higher capacity to actually create so-called immune fire breaks. So this means that pathogens that now live from the forest, let's say, and from animals that have been very kind of have been very further apart from humans, they can now enter through intermediaries, the animal populations in crowded conditions, and enter the pathogens, and from there on go into humans. And these pathogens could actually very quickly evolve. And especially with the long-distance animal trade, what I was just saying, that when animals are traded alive, then pathogens exchange, and new varieties of more, let's say, virulent type of diseases could evolve. What does this mean? Especially in a world of high mobility and of excessive aviation speed and aviation movement of people, that once these pathogens are spread in particular population, they kind of inevitably get spread along the entire humanity. So this is like very much, there's a lot more details on the link between economic growth, the current neoliberal capitalist model of industrial agriculture, and health pandemics. There's a lot more details out there. I've presented a very, let's say, kind of simplified version of this explanation, but kind of there is more and more facts and study that point to the intrinsic link between economic growth and the way our industrial agriculture has been designed to enhance, to contribute to economic growth, and the health pandemics that we have now. I wonder whether someone might have some questions, and I would just pause for a few seconds so that you could just reflect a little bit more and see whether, because I'm going to move to the section about degrowth, so I was wondering whether someone would have a thought or reflection or a short question. You could also write to me in Catalan, so Spanish, and so I would just like pause for a few minutes. Let's take a deep breath, a little bit of silence, and see whether someone wants to write something. would then degrowth be considered as one of the solutions to future? Okay, so we go into degrowth, right? Yeah, I would say degrowth is what. So in that sense, what we argue from the community of degrowth is that we need to kind of really radically change and reorient our model of producing food, and not only, also kind of we need to kind of rethink the way we work, we live, the way we create our immunity, the way we take care of our bodies as humans, the way our medical system is built, and what is the more essential for our lives, which are the essential services that need to be provided. And the pandemic has been kind of a really rich time to reflect on what is the essential, what is the important, what is needed for a good life. So I would move to introducing degrowth before responding, in order to be able to respond deeper to that question. So when talking about degrowth, you should consider that degrowth has three aspects. On the one hand, degrowth is a hypothesis set upon a large number of kind of empirical papers, philosophical streams, and ideas. And I'm going to get into that in a second. Hypothesis. Second one is like the degrowth is a call for radical repoliticization and reorganization of society, with particular political proposals for changing our model at the local level and also at global level. And also degrowth is a bunch of practices. It's a way of acting. And I'm going to go into detail in each one of them. So degrowth is a hypothesis. The hypothesis, which seems that it's kind of more and more getting proved lately, is that we could have a democratically organized downscaling of the global economy, which could not only kind of maintain current level of human well-being, but actually improve it, and while contributing to social justice and environmental sustainability. Or basically, it's a hypothesis that we could live better with less. As simple as that. Then, in terms of degrowth as a kind of slogan for political mobilization and a bunch of calls for political mobilization, degrowth is a call to not only, let's say, stop thinking about economic growth, but actually it's about the idea to abandon the centrality of economic growth in our imaginaries. The idea to abandon the very fixation with the accumulation of capital, let's say, as an overarching societal objective. So in that sense, degrowth is a call for reorganization, starting in the global north, very much based on care, then very much based on the idea of limits, but not limits as externally imposed, but limits as commonly agreed upon, and limits which contribute to our liberation, and actually, as a kind of, when limits are a social choice, then often lead to great abundance. For example, deciding to have kind of to reduce our level of material dependence or material requirement could make us live in great abundance. So limits in that sense in degrowth are not like externally imposed, but something we decide together. Because deciding upon our limits could actually give us more time. Limiting the amount of hours that we want to work in a certain project or in certain, let's say, job could give us more time for the activities that we find meaningful. Degrowth is also a call for political action in terms of politicizing the environmental discussion, or in that sense, making the discourse, all the discussions around sustainable development, not only technical, but let's say socially relevant and actually having a political signification. Then Degrowth is also called for recognizing the damage created by years of colonialism, and addressing the inequality between the South and the North by reparations and by recognizing the ecological debt that has been accumulated. I will go into that in a moment. So that was degrowth in terms of like political demands, and I will at some point I will go over the political demands that we have launched exactly 1 hour ago as the kind of degrowth community to various media, with a number of proposals to address the health crisis in from let's say decolonial and let's say degrowth perspective. I'll get that in a second. So, but let's talk about. It's important also to talk about degrowth as a kind of as practice, as something that could be as an everyday politicized stand of living, but also kind of on personal level, right? And degrowth in terms of our daily choices, our daily way of relating with the outer world, but also degrowth is manifested very much in the high number of community-based initiatives that are emerging over the last years. Let's say community-based peer-to-peer production, intentional communities, eco-communities, food cooperatives, transport cooperatives, energy cooperatives, and many, let's say, time banks, community currencies, etc., etc., etc. So these initiatives are manifestation of the degrowth imaginary, in a sense. And you could also see elements of degrowth emerging in some progressive local governments. For example, the introduction of basic income by Barcelona municipality is one example of this. Before moving on, it's important to kind of make some clarification. That degrowth is not only reducing consumption. For example, in the title of this talk, it was like changing consumption patterns. While degrowth is indeed would lead to changing consumption patterns, what we try to say always is that it's not only about less, but different, right? Then degrowth is not recession or crisis, because like imposing a reduction in economic transaction without changing other elements of the society would lead to recession, just like the financial crisis of 2008. No, degrowth is perceived as a participative process of self-organization on communal, local level, as well as kind of deeper political transformations happening at also national level. So in that sense, degrowth is also kind of not top-down, one linear policy, but let's say a single policy, a single idea of action. No, degrowth implies multiple actions on multiple levels, on varied levels. Then degrowth, many people think of degrowth is the opposite of growth. What we argue here is degrowth cannot be expressed only in terms of GDP or in terms of monetary metrics or only in quantitative terms. Rather, degrowth it has very qualitative meaning. So it's kind of confronting the so-called growth imperative. So the changing of our way of thinking cannot be measured, right? The creation of new social spaces for experimentation cannot be measured. So it's actually not only opposite of growth, not negative growth, but actually qualitative transformation of the society. Other people focus on degrowth, let's say, from population perspective, perceive. So, for example, there's a particular kind of group of individuals that are saying that what we need is population degrowth, and that's actually is going to save our environmental problems. That's not the case. The biggest environmental problems are caused not by growing populations, but rather populations that have higher rates of consumption. So, in that sense, degrowth is not Malthusian. It's not calling for it's not forcing population degrowth, but rather enhancing the rights of conscious procreation and trying to kind of reclaim the capacities of female bodies to decide for themselves, and also to reject the production of cheap labor for increasing for capitalist growth, or soldiers for military operations of the United States, in a sense, or other nations. So in a way, degrowth is a call for more feminized and for gender equality, also in terms of population growth. And the last point of what degrowth is not is catastrophist. So the idea is that many people would say degrowth is inevitable because we're gonna reach a crisis. No, degrowth is not inevitable. Degrowth is about slow, or not so slow, but let's say planned and deliberated construction of society, of the economy. So degrowth is in a way discussed, led by communities, and very much kind of decided upon. It's not a result of a sudden catastrophe, because a sudden catastrophe would actually create a crisis. So in that sense, when you think about degrowth, we think about degrowth in terms of planning it together, designing it together in a rolling way, in constant reflection. So, as I said before, degrowth is a hypothesis that we could live better with less, and there are many reasons to think about that. Degrowth is a kind of and here are the different, let's say, sources of inspiration for degrowth, and then multiple ones. I will go just quickly now, but before going on, I would like to give another moment of silence to see whether someone has something to to comment upon, or I will just stop for, let's say, 30 seconds and see whether someone has something to say or comment or whatever. You could also, by the way, you could also make you don't need to write on the chat. For example, you could make, if Carlos allows, you could also kind of unmute your microphone and make your question in person, so that I could also hear some voices. I don't hear only my own voice. So I don't know, I'll give a few seconds for you to reflect or to have any questions. That's very nice. Very good question. That happiness is a necessity. Yeah, in a way, that's interesting, no? That for the capitalist accumulation, people need to be unhappy in order to, or at least a little bit unhappy, right? In order to get trapped into the constant role of producing more and working more in order to gain more, in order to increase their wage, in order to have a better house, in order to have a better car, in order to have another in order to have a better vacation. In a sense, that has something. Indeed, I would say that capitalist accumulation perhaps requires certain level of unsatisfaction, or at least the problem is that we are very much kind of inserted in certain type of material addiction to better and to more and to higher speed and to faster. So the moment the point is that capitalism keeps us addicted to all that. So, and the moment we get used to certain level of material accumulation, certain kind of standard of living, we need to have more. So capitalism is very good in terms of creating so-called artificial needs. And when our needs are artificial, satisfying them doesn't contribute to our happiness. And here I would go to this happiness source of degrowth, because we started talking about that. Where is the happiness source? Here we go. So, and this is actually very much related to the fact that economic growth or capitalist growth does not increase the social status of everyone. Or, for example, in a world where everyone has a Ferrari, Ferrari wouldn't be a positional good any longer, right? If everyone has certain type of good, then having this good is not satisfying, is not that satisfactory, especially if you have that good for positional purpose, like a Ferrari, or like let's say one fancy boat for traveling. And so that's the problem, that in capitalism, like social status can be achieved just for a very small fraction of the population. And this small fraction of the population has to constantly struggle for more in order to keep their happiness, or they not feel good about themselves, because that's the primary measure for which they kind of perceive their way of happiness. But, and this is like where the interesting thing about happiness studies, that we get used to material standards and constantly need more in order to keep our satisfaction, to avoid drops in our happiness. Yet, our happiness constantly improves if we increase the non-material aspects of our life, let's say the more relational aspects of our life. So by relational aspects, I mean better quality relations, more time for people that are close to us, more time with people with whom we have meaningful and enjoyable interactions, more time for the activities which we consider meaningful, especially in relationship with our surrounding, more time for rewarding activities that give us kind of sense of self meaningfulness as well, but also kind of having more free time that's freed from, let's say, kind of obligatory labor or labor for money that we don't really enjoy. So many studies actually show that the moment that happiness constantly improves when we somehow make a shift and start to refocus on those activities that really matter to us. And here, while it's and here I would like to kind of give you a kind of little glimpse of one study that they did during the crisis in Spain in 2008. This is actually a study that I did for my PhD. And indeed, I did a kind of survey of about 800 individuals from Barcelona, a representative survey of Barcelona, which was had people from all ages, kind of representative in terms of gender. And we found that during the crisis, those individuals who actually lost certain percentage of their income, but still had their basic minimum covered, or let's say they had unemployment benefits, or they had some other source of income, but got more engaged in social and solidarity economy. Let's say they were participating more in, let's say, neighborhood assemblies, urban gardens, food cooperatives, or parents cooperatives, or other type of, or started their project outside Barcelona, for example. Their level of income, their level of happiness did not change from the income loss. So one of the reasons for that, perdona, I see a message. Vale, perdona, this is not a message. Creo que no estoy compartiendo. Ahora no estoy compartiendo. No, estoy compartiendo. No, perdón. Entonces, decreasing. So what we find is that an improvement in the non-material aspects of our lives improves life satisfaction. And another thing is that when we talk about degrowth, when we imagine a society of degrowth, imagine if everyone, let's say, located above the basic minimum standards, right? Let's say relatively richer people have their level of kind of consumption decreased in an equitable way, meaning that those at the top decrease their income more than those at the bottom level. Happiness would not decrease, mostly because of the social comparison. So what happens is that when everyone is kind of experiencing the same lower level of, let's say less, let's imagine if you just need to buy less stuff, if everyone around us is buying less stuff, if everyone around us is not having to change their phones every now and then, everyone around us has to change their car every now and then, if everyone around them doesn't need to change their furniture and then doesn't have to go on a luxurious trip somewhere, you would see that that wouldn't cause a loss in our life satisfaction, especially if we have more time to invest in those activities with the others or not that bring us more meaning. And there we have another issue over there that has to do with the speed of life. And a lot of studies have been finding that actually the acceleration of life, and I'm sure that all of you have experienced that, the acceleration also of education, the speed with which you have to learn, the speed with which you have to teach, the speed with which you have to publish, the speed with which you have to kind of produce more and more and more, actually is disconnecting that work from ourselves, from our sense of meaningfulness. And actually what creates on the long term physical problems, psychological problems, relational problems, and something we call very often in some other studies drops also in social capital. So degrowth is about kind of trying to reconnect with the essential, with the care, with the basic elements of with the basic kind of sources of our good life, right? I would go back a little bit. There is another one. Let's say, if less is more, what certainly is there that there would be a better world. In the past, less was a lifestyle, but it did not prevent conflict. Instead, it led to the spirit of more conflict. We can argue that democracy has caused the change. But what certainly is there that in our period of achieving less, a more brutal authoritarian government would... Yeah, exactly. So completely, I mean, I'm not idealizing the past, not at all, not at all, no, not at all. I mean, especially in terms of the gender representations of gender roles, of course, there's a lot more conflict, there's a lot more armed conflicts. So, of course, we're supposedly living in more democratic society, and that's arguably still a big achievement. So actually, in that sense, we are achieving something. And now it's kind of, amidst the health pandemic, one of the biggest dangers is the arrival of more authoritarian government, indeed. And the right wing is really kind of rising up and saying, okay, we need to kind of close ourselves from the rest, separate ourselves from the Chinese, for example, because from them arrived the virus. Of course, so you could see a lot of kind of semi-fascist response in arriving. So it's kind of very important to kind of prevent that one. So this is another, and I'm moving over to another key source of degrowth and key aspiration of degrowth is the search for autonomy and deeper forms of democracy. For example, degrowth is not about ecological fascism, right? It's not about imposing from above a world of less. It's not about kind of externally setting, it's not about illuminating leaders who come out and close all the streets of cars, although perhaps that would have something positive about it, closing the streets for cars, like a certain part of it. But still, degrowth is conceived, as you could read on this slide, as a very kind of process of deep democratic reconstruction based on the principles of autonomy. So, and this is a key concept in degrowth. It's introduced by people by thinkers like Castoriadis, Illich, or Andre Gortz. And so autonomy is the search for solutions in an inclusive way, where we could also take into consideration the marginal voices and could also kind of look for potentially dissident voices from the majority. So it's about society that constantly builds itself, that a society that could reflect upon its rules and say, okay, the rules that we implemented, let's say 10 years ago, are not valid any longer. Society is changing. I mean, we need to kind of change the institutions. We need to change the laws. So it's about society that has the right to kind of change and continuously changes its aspects. But also kind of, and here we have to think about democratic institutions that are also based on care. And these are institutions that must flourish in a degrowth society. In the new society that we hope it could emerge. And degrowth and democratic infrastructure also implies universal access to healthcare, universal access to basic utilities like water, like housing, like food, and like education, among multiple others. And so here it's interesting also to note that the concept of democracy is related to the influence that technology, this technology that actually makes me connect with you at this level, at this moment, is sometimes is double-edged sword, no? A knife with both edges. On the one hand, it gives us freedom, but on the other hand, if it centralizes and grows too much, this techno infrastructure gets centralized. So as Illich has noted, this equity and energy and innovation grow kind of and together only up to a threshold. And beyond that threshold, the energy and the extraction and the technological innovation and power increase, but at the cost of equity and inclusion. So let's think about now the COVID crisis. Now, what's one of the likely outcomes of the crisis, especially if there is more repercussions of the pandemic, is that we're gonna fortify the system of global surveillance. People being followed on their smartphones, people being ranked with kind of a certain type of points for how well they perform in society, how well they pay how often and frequently they pay the bills, their loans, the mortgage, the rent, how well they behave with their neighbors, etc. So actually, in that sense, degrowth is a call to rethink the democratic foundation of technology and deciding together what type of technological innovations we want and what technological innovation we might not want to have, especially ones related to surveillance, ones that actually ends up limiting our freedom, in a sense. I would have a minute of silence for now to give you the space to write another reflection or question or critique, or just to kind of process it. Well, for the moment, I don't see. Okay. How do we implement some specific strategies? Right. Okay, let's go into the proposals. Actually, it's very special because just today at 10 o'clock in the morning on May 13, and it's very funny that it coincides, we launched with the call for political action called Reimagining the Future After Corona Crisis, a degrowth manifesto. And some of the particular calls are demands. So it's more or less, so these demands look a bit more like strategies, general strategies. The first one, centers around putting life or care at the center of our system, economic system. This means basically phasing out fossil fuel production, and but also military expenditures, and also advertising. Advertising is it's actually one of the first things that could be very easily implemented. Advertising and marketing industries are the ones that are actually fueling, that are kind of forcing consumption forward, and actually especially unnecessary consumption, positional consumption, kind of consumption that's not environmentally kind of friendly, etc. So our first call is like, okay, let's start through there: fossil fuel, polluting industries, military, and advertising, and use the savings from from, let's say, military industry to foster healthcare, education, renewable energy, and ecological agriculture. So going back to small-scale ecological agriculture, agroecology as a principle, let's say local ecological, where we could have kind of interpersonal interaction with the producers, is actually fundamental. For example, one of the interesting facts that happen now with the health crisis is that all local organic producers around Barcelona, but also kind of around Catalonia, have had huge increase in their demands. Of course, like many people, those who could afford it, of course, not, and that's, there is certain issue of privilege here, but nevertheless, there is kind of the demand for local organic produce is is skyrocketing. People have triple, farmers will be having triple increase in their demands, and indeed, local organic agriculture is kind of thriving at the moment, which is kind of very strange. I mean, amidst the crisis, on the other hand. So first demand is like put life at the center, and which means putting health, education, renewable energy, and ecological food production at the center, and dispose of fossil fuel production, military, and advertising. The other demand has to do with redefining work and the type of, and thinking about what's the type of work that we need for a good life, for meaningful life. And again, something that has very much come amidst the health crisis is the importance of care work. Care work at the level of households, especially now when many of us have to take care of our children at the home conditions. Care work in terms of taking care of ill and sick. Care work in terms of keeping all the people who are in kind of who are disadvantaged or in certain type of home, elderly homes, or taking care of the elderly as well. And care work, especially in moments of closure, when you don't have enclosure, moments of when you are not able very easily to see others. So care also for the other is has been really important amidst this crisis, especially in times of confinement. Has been kind of the role of, let's say, also emotional care work has been really important. That's one part of it. Then there is a call from the degrowth community to somehow start to phase out polluting industries and provide retraining for workers from these polluting, let's say, car manufacturing, for example, or let's say, especially luxury car manufacturing, SUV, or let's say drives, or let's say meat production, let's say the factories for mass meat production, or let's say the fossil fuel industry as such, or let's say large-scale mines as well, and provide these workers with the capacity to train themselves in something, and in, let's say, and activities that they might be interested in to start or restart. Because if you look at the way work is being undertaken, very few of the workers that are located there in the polluting industries love what they do. They do it in order to kind of make a living. But it's not that kind of coal workers in the coal mine are completely kind of in love with what they're doing. I think if you offer them sufficient income so that they could somehow have a basic life and could have a kind of reasonable living, they would easily drop the work that's polluting their bodies as well. So that's the thing, provide workers with the capacity to retrain, but also kind of reduce working time. And that's one of the basic proposals that is coming out, emerging within the degrowth community. Reduce working time and share work, especially those work that's actually socially and ecologically caring. Let's say work in the organic farm sector, work in the educational sector, work in the social and solidarity economy, and just work that that's very heavily included, kind of based on care as well. Another pillar of the degrowth demand, that's actually a degrowth manifesto that's launched right now, has to do with the the provision of essential goods and services. So that's very general, but the proposal is basically to start thinking about reducing levels of general consumption and levels of traveling. Because one of the triggers, let's say, not the cause, but one of the triggers for the health epidemic has been kind of the extreme level of high-speed traveling. So, and in that sense, in that sense, we could kind of slow down and localize a little bit the economies. So, talking about the workers and the phasing out of a certain type of polluting industries, the workers that kind of laid out or having the factories closed. For example, right now the automobile sector and the aviation industry are in quite big, let's say, turn, or kind of in something like an earthquake. And so all the workers there shall be provided with universal basic income. And actually the proposal of Decreixement is to introduce a universal basic income as a way to provide individuals the time to breathe, the time to rebuild themselves, the time to feel secure, and to educate themselves and to train themselves with the new skills in order to enter into jobs or to create the employment that they find meaningful, and to create the, let's say, the enterprises that they consider kind of worth investing into. Another particular demand within Decreixement communities is the installing of a maximum, of a top level of income. So it has to do with progressive taxation. This means that no one can earn more than, let's say, certain particular level of income, and all the rest gets taxed away and used for the provision of universal basic income. So in that sense, combining a minimum income and a maximum income is one way to make to organize society in a more just and equitable way. So another important pillar of the Decreixement of color has to do with democracy, as kind of as someone of you was commenting right now. Okay. There's another question. I would address it right now. So in that sense, Decreixement is about decommodification and the kind of reducing the financialization of sectors like energy, food, housing, so that, for example, the housing is not in the financial market. Food also is taken out of financial markets. And actually, Decreixement is very much kind of in favor of slowly phasing out financial markets, mostly because of their very destructive influence on the energy provision, on food provision and food quality, on the kind of growth imperative of housing provision, of kind of profitable housing provision, and health and education. And of course, democratizing society means enhancing the economic activities that are based on, let's say, workers' cooperative, and at the same time reducing the power of the corporate sector. Yeah, and all this needs to go into thinking of how the global north could actually provide reparations to the global south for all the damage for all the damage incurred over the colonial and post-colonial epochs. Let's say this means like thinking of the intersectional and intergenerational justice. That's kind of the basic kind of line of the proposals, and I would go read the other question. The changes in patterns of consumption don't have to be quantitative, but also qualitative. And so within the logic of how can we create democratic mechanism to guide production, to guide that ends? How could we approach the aggregation problem of deciding what is and what is not necessary? Yeah, so, I mean, in a way, it's very interesting. To decide that democratically, we need, let's say, spaces of participation. We need somehow to think about inclusion of different voices at different level, at the level of the, let's say, the locality. So it's kind of, so you're basically saying, how can we democratize production, given so far production has been basically driven by market logic. So how can we remove market logic, and how can we install democracy and, let's say, social concerns in order to kind of get rid of the kind of the agglomeration problem? I would say that the response to that is twofold. On the one hand, we need a kind of certain type of regulations that are guided by the precautionary principle. For example, given more and more evidence is provided of the destructive and highly problematic effects of, let's say, industrial meat production, perhaps we need governance measures that phase out that industry. But at the same time, this needs to be coupled up with spaces where of participation at the local level. For example, at the regional level, where big part of populations actually is working in the sector of industrial animal production and industrial animal feed production, we need somehow forums or assemblies of workers where we could jointly think of the solutions that could come together. For example, what I was saying, the introduction also of a basic minimum income would provide a cushion for those workers that are working in the industries and that are kind of temporarily laid off until they find something that they could substitute their work with. And at the same time, if you the way to localize production is on one hand, indeed, with stricter environmental regulation, with reducing environmental regulation in terms of reducing international trade, but also in terms of, let's say, it's very interesting to see how now during the crisis, the force of the cooperative movements is really kind of, and the demand of people for local and organic production, and the more care that people start to put into what they eat. Well, not everyone, but there is a kind of tiny trend. It's actually emerging. So you could see that beyond governmental regulation, you could see that there is increased level of consciousness among individuals, let's say, among people based on the social solidarity economy, who start to organize into food cooperatives. And when you have food cooperatives, they often demand and require for the production. And the other way around, the more small organic farms emerge, the more they provide kind of offer, the more they could reach out to their localities, and the more kind of villages and towns are aware of the organic and the health and social and environmental benefits of local organic produce, the higher the demand. So it's kind of a kind of flow, the chicken and egg kind of connection. So I would say that this localized economic dynamics, which has started to emerge within the sector of the social solidarity economy, within the organic agriculture movement, is already showing the way. But there is another danger over there, and that has to do with the let's say, the entry of the big corporate sector in the organic production. That's kind of bringing down prices and making the life of very many small farms unsustainable, and they're not able to sell their produce. So in that sense, we need also regulation that contributes to the emergence, and that kind of creates beneficial environment for all small producers as well. I don't know, Unai, whether that answers your question. Basically, the question is that we need a mixture between bottom-up and top-down projects. Please go ahead, Alejandra. Yeah. Please ask about the demands. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, please. Finally, a voice. Yes.
Okay, yeah. So regarding the demands, I was wondering, because it's all based on demanding some sort of political action, right? And it's quite some detail, like it's really detailed as demands. But the thing is, I think that in order to implement this, because of the huge role that lobbying has nowadays in the policy makers and the decisions taken by our governments, and the obvious like immediate negative results these measures would have in terms of destroying employment or reducing tax revenues for the government, and the social implications of reduced tax revenues in terms of government spending. What do the incentives, where are the incentives for the governments in order to implement these measures? Where do they lie? Because I think it's the most important thing to actually create those incentives for governments to actually start implementing this kind of measures.
Yeah, thanks. That's important question. I mean, in a different moment of time and space, I would answer this question differently. But right now, actually, amidst the health crisis, and when it's becoming more and more clear that we need to restructure the economy, we need to restructure production and the model upon which we are based in order to avoid future pandemics. So actually, I would say the incentive of the government should come. Of course, we have different governments. We have more left-wing governments, which are, let's say, more progressive, but also, let's say, more focused on job provision. And so far, we don't have many environmentally minded governments, indeed. And you have more right-wing governments, let's say Trump, etc., who are more concerned, who want more about closing borders and defending kind of. So, but still, right now, if governments are really interested in preventing future pandemics, because there's more and more indications that this is just the beginning, that more and more viruses are going to flee out and going to kind of, this virus could keep on mutating, etc. So in order to we can't just stay in confinement every let's say every 2 years for a while, for 3 months. I don't know. We need to in order to avoid that, we need policymakers that are really capable to grasp the roots of the problem. And if governments are really interested in in the health and good life of their citizens, we need to put life at the center. And putting life at the center means, indeed, the introduction of basic income, universal basic income, as a first measure. Actually, the introducing of basic income should happen before the closure of all these industries. And the introduction of basic income could be financed by for example, from this year, the world governments have spent the largest amount of funds on military expenditures. So this is one of the if world governments decide upon this reducing military expenditure, that's one way. Another way is you could see how quickly European governments actually found funds to support all the workers and all the industries that were in turmoil. They could find funds. Issuing bonds is one, but it's not perfect measure because it increases inflation. But actually, that's the introduction of basic income doesn't mean that tax revenues will not come, because basic income still means that people keep on buying. People are still able to so tax are still generated. So certain part of that comes back. So right now the basic incentive would be just stop environmental destruction, stop deforestation, change our model of producing and consuming and traveling, and rethink what's really what is it that makes people healthy. Because after all, I think another big change that's happening right now is people asking themselves, what is more important, my life or my job, right? And perhaps some people start to value life more than their job. And putting health or good life in the center means rethinking, starting to live simply, starting to live with less, because actually living simply and moving to a lower level of material needs implies you need to earn less as well. So it's not governments that they're going to kind of create this change of consciousness, but I believe that if governments have this start with a little push towards more healthcare, people will be also concerned, and people will know, and the fear that the kind of damage and the kind of the turmoil internally, externally that this virus has created has made many worry also about their health. And some people have started to worry more about their health than for their job, because they know, okay, probably I'll survive. I'll find a piece of land somewhere. I'll grow a little bit of tomatoes and potatoes, or I would find a job somewhere. I'll start a little cooperative with my company, with my compañeras, etc. So it's kind of so I think now it's really crucial time, because finally we figure out that life is more important. There is another question here. Don't you think that this global basic income would lead to global inefficiency in the market, since people don't potentially have incentive to innovate and therefore produce less? And then less production, less governmental and economic resources, therefore the governments wouldn't be able to provide the minimum income. It's a vicious circle. I would create a different type of, that's the circle that you're thinking of is the world as it is now, introducing only global basic income without complementary measures. But let's say imagine a global basic income which is coupled with increasing measures to trigger the social solidarity economy. So when you give the people the time and the minimum income to kind of to really start their own initiatives, you could see that a lot of innovation is occurring, but not corporate-led innovation, but more, let's say, grassroots innovation. This is something I've been kind of investigating, let's say, 3 years ago, like Carlos asked me about it, the TEST project, the project on community-led initiatives. So there is a lot of invisible innovation taking place at the community level, and at the level of peer-to-peer production, especially at the level of commoning, at the level of time banks, the level of community currencies, etc. So this type of innovation is, and problem is that corporate innovation so far, it's the corporate innovation that's creating the vicious circle of creating more artificial needs, kind of growing more and creating more environmental devastation, creating more health pandemics. So actually, this is the vicious circle that we need to go out of. So in that sense, the introduction of a basic income coupled together with possibility to create employment in the social solidarity kind of sector, to create kind of, let's say, middle size or large size cooperatives, workers' cooperatives, could create a lot of innovation and could be a source of revenues also for the government. It's not that and interesting thing is that, for example, I've been looking into basic income experiments. Let's say the municipality of Barcelona introduced basic income for let's say 100 individuals located in the Besós area, and municipality of Utrecht has been introducing basic income. Finland there've been multiple experiments, and it's interesting to see that it's not that people work less with basic income; they just work differently. They start them mini initiatives that sometimes they're not always successful. Some survives, other not. But even from the unsuccessful ones, there is a lot we could learn. So it's kind of people are productive, but the great thing is that the people are productive not driven by the logic of generating profits, because that's the logic that's actually destroying the earth, and it's actually destroying our health. And this is the type of logic that could end up regenerating life and regenerating our economy and regenerating our health in a way. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. Wow, it's almost 2 minutes before 12. I don't know, great to hear some more reflections. And I feel sorry that it's only me speaking. It's horrible to be alone here with a computer and not being able to see your faces or hear your voices. I don't know. Perhaps one final question before we close. Perhaps you're tired from so much screen. as well. Listening only to looking at the screen is kind of not so easy going always.
Si no hi ha cap altra pregunta, jo faig una per tancar i ja acabem. Deixo uns moments per si voleu fer una altra pregunta.
Yeah, please, Musa, go ahead. How would degrowth handle the backlash from corporations with power and money? No idea. Yeah, completely. Indeed, there is a kind of huge backlash. Of course, now you can see how the European Union is bailing out aviation industry, is bailing out, it's about to bail out Volkswagen. And is not gonna be easy. That's the question of power. How do we shatter the architecture of power and finance that's so big? There's different theories. There is, let's say, starting from the grassroots level, there is this theory, let's say, this kind of multi-level theory that says that if you start from, let's say, micro level innovation, let's say in food, in the energy sector, in the food, let's say, and the more initiatives come all together, they could replicate, and attract with them more consumers. And at some point, they would get so big that they could overtake the existing regime, which means, basically would mean drawing consumers more to the organic and social solidarity sector, which means that corporations would lose consumers. That's one thing. Of course, that's not very likely to happen on its own. It's kind of very difficult. We've seen rather corporations are actually taking over small initiatives and actually co-opting sustainability in a sense. The other one is people pressure and increasing mobilization, and because eventually people see that the better quality jobs are very often provided not by the corporate sector and not by the especially polluting and exploitative corporate sector, but rather within the sector of the small scale business and solidarity and social enterprises and social undertakings. So kind of another shift could be in terms of people's voting preferences changing and people putting pressure on governments. Of course, that's not so easy. We've seen that many people prefer their kind of stable jobs in whatever factory or company it's out there. So it's kind of this is the question. This is the $1 million question, right? And the interesting thing is that we don't have a right answer. We keep on inventing it piece by piece. But the health crisis that happened now and has impacted also corporate sector so deeply and the financial market so deeply that it could be that with extreme environmental pressures, the financial markets would suffer a lot of turmoil and corporations might self-destroy themselves, who knows? Especially with you have seen what happened now with the fossil fuel sector, right? There is a lot of when the price of oil dropped down so much, there is a lot of companies who are losing stocks and shares, and their kind of portfolios are really kind of losing a lot. So who knows? Who knows? There's a bunch of factors that come together that could provide the answer. Yeah. Yeah, it's almost, well, it's 3 minutes past 12. I guess we will be. I could.
Com
Yeah.
como quiera usted, si quiere hacer un poco más, creo que hay preguntas en la recámara, sí, pero ya dijo que tenía que irse, si tenía que irse no pasa nada. Ha sido un placer.
Sure, of course, you can get the slides. I would also send you my email address. So I could hardly present. There's kind of so much more in the slides. So please go over them, and if you have any question, write me. Or we're always interested in having students from the economic background with us to do some internship or some kind of master thesis. So if you're interested in writing something on degrowth for your master thesis, whatever, whenever, just get in touch. I'll be, yeah, we could work together in some way. Yeah. So, Carles, do I close myself?
Sí, sí. Bueno, moltes gràcies, Filka. A mi m'agrada moltíssim.
Sí, a vosaltres.
Moltíssimes preguntes. Sí, ha estat molt bé la ponència, ens agrada moltíssim.
Sí, a vosotras es como, sí, me habría sido poder estar más presencial, pero espero que cuando pase todo esto, el año que viene hacemos otra, cara a cara. Yeah.
Por parte nuestra, encantados porque nos encanta tenerlo.
Sí, encantada. Espero que os haya servido de algo. Gracias, Kiera. Gracias, Ches. Gracias, Alessandra. Gracias a Musa y todos los demás que han escrito y no me han dejado aquí sola hablando a mí misma. Gracias a Jean y a todos. Y a Patricia. Y sí. Gracias.
I ja per acabar, recordar que els Crash fem assemblees els dilluns a les 7, ara és telemàticament, si voleu fer assemblees només envieu un missatge per Instagram o per Twitter. La setmana que ve tenim el Pol Entràs fent ponència, que és doctorat per l'MIT i professor de Harvard, i he pensat que amb la proposta d'Alejandra que vol tenir les presentacions, si algú vol ens pot escriure per Instagram o per mail i li passem les presentacions que la Filka ens les ha fet arribar. Així Filka traiem feina a sobre i ja ens encarreguem nosaltres d'enviar-la a qui vulgui la presentació.
Vale. Ok, ciao.
Doncs ja és tot. Adéu a tothom.